The gunshot that shattered Caroline Montgomery's wedding day came from somewhere in the canyon walls. And by the time the screaming stopped, 3 men lay dead in the dust, and her bridegroom was galloping away with the stolen church collection box, leaving her standing alone in her white silk dress among the overturned wagons. She had met Thomas Garrett only 6 weeks earlier in Santa Fe, where her father had sent her from Boston to recover from a bout of pneumonia in the dry New Mexico air. Thomas had seemed like everything a woman could want: handsome, charming, well-dressed, and eager to marry. Her father had approved the match through telegraph correspondence, pleased that his daughter had found a respectable merchant willing to settle down. The wedding was planned quickly: a small ceremony in the chapel at San Miguel, followed by a procession to Thomas's ranch property 30 miles north. Caroline's aunt had helped her into the beautiful wedding dress that morning, imported silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, and she had felt like the luckiest woman in the New Mexico territory. Now, as November wind cut through the canyon and the sun began its descent toward the western ridges, Caroline understood that Thomas Garrett had never been a merchant at all. The 3 dead men were his associates, killed by whoever had ambushed their party, and the wedding guests had scattered like quail at the first shot. One of the dead men had gasped out enough words before he died for Caroline to understand the truth. Thomas ran with a gang of thieves who worked the trail between Santa Fe and Taos, robbing churches and travelers, and this wedding had been nothing but a cover for their latest theft. The realization hit her harder than the cold. She had been a fool, a naive Boston girl who believed a charming smile and sweet words. Her father would be devastated when he learned the truth. Her aunt back in Santa Fe probably already knew something had gone terribly wrong, since the wedding party should have reached the ranch by now. Caroline looked down at her white dress, now torn at the hem where she had stumbled over rocks, dust covering the delicate silk. Her hands were shaking, though she could not tell if it was from cold or shock or rage. She made herself move. Standing here would accomplish nothing, and the sun was dropping fast. November nights in the high desert were brutal, and she had no coat, no food, no water. The wagons had been ransacked by whoever attacked them, everything of value taken or scattered. She found a canteen with perhaps 2 inches of water remaining and clutched it like treasure. Then she began walking south, back toward Santa Fe, though she knew the town was at least 15 miles away. The temperature dropped as the sun touched the horizon. Caroline's teeth began chattering within an hour, and by the time darkness settled over the canyon, she was shivering so violently she could barely walk. The torn hem of her dress caught on sage and cactus, ripping further with each step. Her delicate wedding shoes, meant for dancing at a reception that would never happen, were falling apart on the rocky trail. She could feel blisters forming, then breaking, but she forced herself to keep moving because stopping meant freezing to death in this forsaken canyon. She did not hear the horse until it was almost upon her. Caroline spun around, heart hammering, certain that Thomas had returned to finish whatever cruel plan he had started. But the man on the dark horse was not Thomas Garrett. He was taller, broader in the shoulders, wearing a heavy coat and a hat pulled low against the wind. In the moonlight, she could see his face was weathered and serious, with several days of stubble on his jaw and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough but not unkind, "you are going to freeze to death out here." Caroline tried to answer, but her teeth were chattering too hard. She wrapped her arms around herself, the torn silk dress providing absolutely no protection against the cold. The cowboy dismounted in one smooth motion and began unbuttoning his heavy sheepskin coat. "No," Caroline managed to say, "you need it." "I have got layers," he said simply. "You have got nothing but that dress." He held out the coat, and when she hesitated, he stepped closer and draped it over her shoulders himself. The weight and warmth of it were shocking, and Caroline felt tears spring to her eyes at the simple kindness of the gesture. "Thank you," she whispered. The cowboy studied her for a long moment, his eyes moving from her torn dress to her ruined shoes to her face, which she knew must be streaked with dust and tears. "There was trouble up the canyon today," he said. "I heard the shots. Are you hurt?" "No," Caroline said, "not hurt. Just cold and stupid." Something that might have been sympathy crossed his face. "I would not call surviving stupid," he said. "Can you tell me what happened?" Caroline took a shaking breath and gave him the shortest version she could manage. The wedding that was not a wedding, the ambush, Thomas's betrayal and flight, the dead men left behind. The cowboy's expression grew darker as she spoke, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Thomas Garrett," he said finally. "I have heard that name. He has been running cons from here to Colorado for the past 2 years. The law wants him for robbery and fraud." He looked at Caroline with something like regret. "I am sorry, ma'am. That is a hard thing to learn on what should have been a happy day." "My name is Caroline," she said, because suddenly she could not bear to be called ma'am one more time, as if she were someone respectable and married instead of a fool who had nearly wed a criminal. "Caroline Montgomery." "James Holloway," the cowboy said, touching the brim of his hat. "Most people call me Holt." He glanced up at the sky where clouds were beginning to obscure the moon. "Miss Montgomery, I need to get you somewhere warm. My ranch is about 8 miles west of here. It is not fancy, but it has got a fire and food and a spare room where you can rest. In the morning, I can take you back to Santa Fe if that is where you want to go." Caroline knew she should be cautious about going anywhere with a strange man, but she was so cold she could barely think, and something in Holt's steady gaze made her believe he was telling the truth. Besides, what choice did she have? Stay here and freeze or trust this cowboy who had given her his coat? "All right," she said. "Thank you." Holt nodded and moved back to his horse, a sturdy dark bay with intelligent eyes. He swung up into the saddle, then reached down for Caroline. "Put your foot on mine and give me your hand," he said. "I will pull you up." It took 2 tries because Caroline's legs were shaking so badly, but finally she managed to get behind him on the horse, settling onto the back of the saddle. Holt adjusted her grip so she was holding onto his waist, and Caroline felt the solid warmth of him through his shirt. "Hold tight," Holt said, and urged the horse into a steady walk. They rode through the darkness in silence, Caroline clinging to Holt's back as the horse picked its way along the trail. The coat helped, but she was still shivering, and she found herself pressing closer to Holt's warmth without quite meaning to. He did not seem to mind, just kept the horse moving at a pace that was quick enough to matter but careful enough not to risk a stumble in the dark. After what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, Caroline saw a light ahead. As they drew closer, she could make out the shape of a small ranch house, sturdy and well-built, with a barn nearby and a corral where several horses were standing. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Caroline felt a rush of gratitude so strong it was almost painful. Holt rode right up to the porch and dismounted, then reached up to help Caroline down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, and he steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "Easy," he said. "Let me get you inside, then I will see to the horse." The interior of the house was simple but clean. A main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area in one corner, and 2 doors that presumably led to bedrooms. A fire was burning low in the fireplace, and Holt quickly added wood to bring it back to life. The warmth was incredible, and Caroline moved toward it like a moth to flame. "Sit," Holt said, gesturing to a chair near the fire. "I will be right back." He disappeared outside, and Caroline sank into the chair, pulling his coat tighter around herself. Now that she was in the light, she could see just how filthy her wedding dress was, the white silk stained with dust and blood from when she had knelt beside one of the dying men. The lace at the collar was torn, and the hem was in tatters. She looked like a ghost, she thought. A ghost of the foolish girl who had believed in Thomas Garrett's lies. Holt came back inside a few minutes later, carrying his saddlebags. He set them down and moved to the kitchen, where he began pumping water into a kettle. I am going to heat some water so you can wash up if you want, he said. I have got some stew left from dinner that I can warm up, and there is bread. It is not much, but it will help. You do not have to do all this, Caroline said, though she wanted the food and hot water more than she could express. You have had a hell of a day, Holt said bluntly. The least I can do is offer you a meal and a warm place to sleep. He set the kettle on a hook over the fire, then turned to look at her directly. Miss Montgomery, I want you to know that you are safe here. I will sleep out in the barn tonight so you can have privacy. The bedroom on the right is mine, but you are welcome to it. I will change the sheets. Caroline felt her eyes fill with tears again at the simple decency of the offer. Thank you, she said. I do not know how to repay you for this kindness. No repayment needed, Holt said. Just doing what anyone should do. He hesitated, then added, I am sorry about what happened to you today. Garrett is a bastard and you deserved better. The blunt words, spoken without pity or condescension, somehow made Caroline feel a little less foolish. I should have known, she said. My father always said I was too trusting, too quick to believe the best in people. That is not a character flaw, Holt said. He moved back to the kitchen and began slicing bread. The world needs people who can still see the good in others. It is the liars and thieves who are at fault, not the people who trust them. Caroline watched him work, this quiet cowboy who had stopped to help a stranger in a torn wedding dress. He moved with the easy efficiency of someone used to taking care of himself, and she found herself wondering about his story. Why was he out here alone? Did he have family? What had brought him to this small ranch in the New Mexico territory? I am sorry for being such a disaster on your doorstep, Caroline said after a moment. This is not how I imagined my wedding day ending. A small smile crossed Holt's face, the first she had seen from him. I imagine not, he said, though I would wager it is not how Garrett imagined it either. Someone shot up his party pretty good. Do you know who? Caroline asked. Could be any number of people, Holt said. Garrett has made enemies. Could have been another gang trying to muscle in on his territory or someone with a grudge or just bad luck. He brought her a plate with bread and butter. Stew will be ready in a few minutes. Caroline took the bread gratefully and ate, surprised by how hungry she was. The butter was fresh and rich, the bread homemade and still relatively soft. Holt busied himself with the stew, and Caroline found the silence between them surprisingly comfortable. After everything that had happened, it was a relief to sit in a warm house with someone who did not expect anything from her, did not need her to be charming or entertaining or anything other than what she was, exhausted and grateful. The stew, when it came, was simple but good, beef and potatoes and carrots in a rich broth. Caroline ate 2 bowls before she finally felt satisfied, and by then the kettle was boiling. Holt poured hot water into a basin and set it in the bedroom with a cloth and a bar of soap, along with one of his clean shirts for her to sleep in. It will be too big, but it is better than sleeping in that dress, he said. I will leave you to get cleaned up. I will be out in the barn if you need anything. Wait, Caroline said. You do not have to sleep in the barn, I trust you. Holt looked at her for a long moment. Appreciate that, he said, but you have had a rough day and I do not want you to feel uncomfortable. Barn is fine. I have slept in worse places. Before Caroline could argue further, he collected a blanket and headed for the door. Lock this behind me, he said, and get some rest. Tomorrow we will figure out what to do next. Then he was gone and Caroline was alone in the small ranch house. She locked the door as he had instructed, then made her way to the bedroom. The hot water and soap felt like the greatest luxury in the world, and she scrubbed away the dust and grime of the day until her skin felt clean again. The wedding dress she left in a heap on the floor, unable to bear looking at it any longer. Holt's shirt was indeed enormous on her, hanging down to her knees, but it was soft and warm and smelled faintly of wood smoke and leather. The bed was comfortable, the sheets clean, and Caroline thought she would fall asleep immediately. Instead, she lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling and replaying the events of the day. The wedding that never was, Thomas's betrayal, the gunshots and screaming. And then Holt, appearing out of the darkness like something from a story, offering his coat and his help without asking for anything in return. She thought about his hands as he helped her onto the horse, careful and strong. The way he had spoken to her without pity, treating her like a person instead of a victim. The simple kindness of hot food and a safe place to sleep. After Thomas's elaborate lies and false charm, there was something deeply appealing about Holt's quiet honesty. Caroline finally drifted off to sleep with those thoughts, and for the first time since arriving in the New Mexico territory, she felt safe. She woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Sunlight was streaming through the small window, and for a disoriented moment, Caroline could not remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The wedding, the betrayal, Holt finding her on the trail. She sat up slowly, every muscle in her body aching from yesterday's ordeal. She found her torn wedding dress still on the floor and grimaced at the sight of it. There was no way she could wear it again, but she had no other clothes. After a moment of hesitation, she put the dress back on over Holt's shirt, using the fabric to cover herself as modestly as possible. Her hair was a disaster, but she did her best to braid it simply and pin it up. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Holt at the stove, cooking breakfast. He had cleaned up since last night, his face freshly shaved and his hair damp from washing. He looked younger than she had thought, probably in his late 20s with strong features and steady gray eyes. "Morning," he said. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I expected," Caroline admitted. "Thank you again for everything." "Coffee is ready," Holt said, gesturing to the pot on the stove. "Breakfast will be done in a minute. We can talk about what you want to do next." Caroline poured herself coffee and sat at the small table, wrapping both hands around the warm cup. Holt brought over plates of eggs and bacon and fried potatoes, then sat down across from her. For a few minutes, they ate in silence, and Caroline found herself studying him more openly in the daylight. He had the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors, with lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into the sun. His hands were calloused and scarred from work, and he moved with the careful economy of someone used to hard labor. "I need to get back to Santa Fe," Caroline said finally. "My aunt will be worried sick, and I need to send a telegram to my father in Boston. He needs to know what happened." Holt nodded. "I can take you there today. It is about a 3-hour ride from here." "I do not want to impose any further on your time," Caroline said. "It is no imposition," Holt said. "I need to go into town anyway to pick up supplies." He hesitated, then added, "Miss Montgomery, you should know that word of what happened yesterday will have spread by now. Small territory and news travels fast. You may face some difficult questions when you get back." Caroline had not thought about that, and the realization made her stomach clench. People would assume she had known about Thomas's criminal activities. They would whisper that she had been part of his gang, or at best, a fool who should have known better. Her reputation, already fragile as an unmarried woman traveling alone, would be in tatters. "I suppose I will deal with that when I have to," she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. Holt looked at her with something like respect. For what it is worth, anyone who knows you for 5 minutes will know you had nothing to do with Garrett's crimes. You have got honest eyes. The compliment, delivered in his matter-of-fact way, made Caroline feel a little stronger. "Thank you," she said. "That means more than you know." After breakfast, Holt offered to ride into town to fetch Caroline some proper clothes before they made the journey to Santa Fe, but Caroline refused. The sooner she faced this mess, the better. Holt found her a spare pair of his pants and a shirt, which she put on over her torn dress after rolling up the cuffs several times. She looked ridiculous, but at least she would be warm for the ride. They set out mid-morning, Caroline once again seated behind Holt on his horse. In the daylight, she could see the landscape properly. Red rock mesas rising in the distance, scrub brush and juniper dotting the hillsides, the vast blue sky stretching overhead. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, so different from the green hills of Massachusetts. Caroline had thought she loved it when she first arrived, but now she was not sure what she felt about this wild territory that had brought her such pain. They rode mostly in silence, but it was not uncomfortable. Holt pointed out landmarks occasionally, showing her the way the trail wound through the canyon, and Caroline found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the horse's gait. She was acutely aware of Holt's solid presence in front of her, the way she had to hold onto his waist to keep her balance. There was something steadying about him, she thought. Something that made her feel like maybe everything would work out after all. They were about an hour outside Santa Fe when they encountered a group of riders coming the other way. Caroline tensed, but Holt raised a hand in greeting and the lead rider returned the gesture. "Holt," the man said, reining in his horse. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest. His eyes moved to Caroline with curiosity. "This the young lady who was supposed to marry Thomas Garrett yesterday?" "This is Miss Caroline Montgomery," Holt said evenly. "I found her on the trail last night after Garrett abandoned her during that ambush up in Dead Man's Canyon." The sheriff's expression softened slightly. "Miss Montgomery, I am Sheriff Dawson. We have been looking for you since your aunt reported you missing last night. Can you tell me what happened?" Caroline took a deep breath and told her story again, more fully this time. She explained how she had met Thomas in Santa Fe, how quickly the courtship had progressed, the wedding ceremony that morning. She described the journey to what Thomas had claimed was his ranch, the sudden ambush in the canyon, and Thomas's flight with the stolen collection box. She told them about the dead men and the scattered wedding party and how Holt had found her hours later, shivering and alone. The sheriff listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When Caroline finished, he nodded slowly. "That matches what we have pieced together from other sources," he said. "We found the bodies this morning. One of them was Jake Hollister, who was wanted for armed robbery. The other two were associates of Garrett's as well." He looked at Caroline with something like pity. "Miss Montgomery, I am sorry to say this, but you were never legally married. Thomas Garrett is not his real name, and the man who performed your ceremony was not an ordained minister. He is part of Garrett's gang, and they have used that wedding scam before to gain access to churches and rob them." Caroline had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed still made her feel sick. She nodded, unable to speak. "We have got men out looking for Garrett and the rest of his gang," the sheriff continued. "I do not suppose you have any idea where he might have gone." "No," Caroline said. "He never told me anything real about himself. Everything was a lie." "Figured as much," the sheriff said. "Well, we will find him eventually. Men like that always make a mistake." He looked at Holt. "I appreciate you looking after Miss Montgomery. I will make sure her aunt knows she is safe." "We are heading into Santa Fe now," Holt said. "I will see her safely to her aunt's house." "Good man," the sheriff said. He tipped his hat to Caroline. "Miss Montgomery, you will need to come by my office in the next few days to give a formal statement, but for now, go get some rest. You have been through a lot." The riders continued on their way, and Holt urged his horse forward again. Caroline felt simultaneously relieved and humiliated by the encounter. At least the sheriff had believed her, but she knew that would not stop people from talking. They reached Santa Fe just after noon, riding down the dusty streets to her aunt's house near the plaza. Before they even reached the gate, the door flew open and Caroline's aunt came rushing out, her face streaked with tears. "Caroline, oh, thank God." Aunt Margaret pulled Caroline off the horse and into a fierce embrace. "I was so worried. When you did not arrive last night, I knew something terrible had happened, and then the sheriff came this morning and said there had been shooting, and I thought you were dead." "I am all right, Aunt Margaret," Caroline said, hugging her back. "I am sorry I worried you." Margaret pulled back to look at Caroline properly, taking in the torn wedding dress visible beneath Holt's oversized clothes, the exhaustion on her niece's face. "What happened?" "The sheriff said something about Thomas being a criminal." "It is a long story," Caroline said tiredly. Can we go inside? Margaret finally seemed to notice Holt still sitting on his horse. And who is this? This is James Holloway, Caroline said. He found me on the trail last night and gave me shelter at his ranch. If it were not for him, I would have frozen to death. Margaret's expression transformed into one of immense gratitude. Mr. Holloway, please come inside. I want to thank you properly for saving my niece. That is not necessary, ma'am, Holt said, but Margaret was already insisting, and eventually he dismounted and tied his horse to the fence. Inside, Caroline told the whole story again while Aunt Margaret made tea and fussed over her niece. Holt sat quietly in the corner, and Caroline was grateful for his steady presence as she relived the awful events. When she finished, Margaret was crying again, alternating between relief that Caroline was safe and fury at Thomas Garrett for his deception. Your father is going to be devastated, Margaret said. I sent him a telegram this morning saying you were missing. I should send another now to say you have been found. I will go with you to the telegraph office, Caroline said. She turned to Holt, who had risen as if to leave. Mr. Holloway, I do not know how to thank you. You saved my life. Holt looked uncomfortable with the praise. You would have found your way, he said. You are stronger than you think. Still, Caroline said, I owe you a debt I can never repay. No debt, Holt said firmly. He moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at her. If you need anything, Miss Montgomery, my ranch is always open to you. And if you decide you want to go back to Boston, I hope you will let me know before you leave. There was something in his voice that made Caroline's heart skip. I will, she promised. After Holt left, Margaret insisted that Caroline bathe and change into proper clothes before they went to the telegraph office. It felt strange to put on a regular dress after the drama of the wedding gown, but it was also a relief to look normal again. Caroline pinned up her hair and tried to compose herself for the ordeal ahead. The next few days were difficult. Caroline gave her formal statement to the sheriff, enduring his questions with as much dignity as she could muster. She sent a long telegram to her father explaining what had happened, and received a reply saying he was making arrangements to come to Santa Fe immediately to bring her home. She faced the whispers and stares when she went into town, holding her head high even as she felt the weight of judgment and speculation. Through it all, she found her thoughts returning to Holt. She remembered the warmth of his coat around her shoulders, the steady way he had helped her onto his horse, the simple kindness of hot food and a safe place to sleep. He had asked nothing of her, expected nothing. After Thomas's elaborate lies and manipulation, Holt's quiet honesty felt like water in the desert. A week after the failed wedding, Caroline received word that Thomas Garrett and 2 members of his gang had been captured trying to cross the border into Colorado. They would stand trial for robbery, fraud, and murder. Caroline was relieved but also exhausted by the whole ordeal. She wanted it to be over, wanted to move on with her life. Her father arrived 2 weeks after the incident, traveling by train and then stage from Boston. Charles Montgomery was a successful banker, stern but loving, and he embraced Caroline with rare open emotion when he arrived. I am so sorry, Papa, Caroline said, crying into his shoulder. I was so foolish. No, Charles said firmly, holding her at arm's length to look at her. You were trusting, and that scoundrel took advantage of your good nature. This is not your fault, Caroline. Do you understand me? Caroline wanted to believe him, but the shame still burned. Everyone in Santa Fe thinks I am an idiot. Then we will return to Boston and leave Santa Fe behind, Charles said. You can start fresh at home, away from all these bad memories. The idea of going home was appealing. Boston meant familiar streets, old friends, a life where she understood the rules. But as Caroline thought about it over the next few days, she realized she did not want to run away. She had come to New Mexico to recover from illness, but she had found something more than health in the high desert air. She had found a kind of freedom, a sense that she could be someone different here, someone braver than the sheltered Boston girl she had been, and there was Holt. She kept thinking about him, wondering what he was doing on his ranch, whether he ever thought about her. She had sent him a note thanking him again for his help, but she had received no reply. Perhaps he had forgotten about her already, moved on to his work and his life. But Caroline could not forget him. 3 days before her father planned to take her back to Boston, Caroline made a decision. She borrowed her aunt's buggy and drove out to Holt's ranch alone, telling Margaret she needed to deliver a proper thank-you gift. Her aunt had packed a basket of preserves and bread, but Caroline knew the food was just an excuse. The ride took longer than she expected because she was not as familiar with the trail in daylight and driving a buggy by herself. But eventually, she recognized the landmarks Holt had pointed out, and then she saw his ranch ahead, the small, sturdy house and barn just as she remembered. Holt was working in the corral when she arrived, training a young horse. He looked up at the sound of the buggy and for a moment just stared, as if he could not quite believe she was there. Then he secured the horse and walked over, wiping his hands on his pants. "Miss Montgomery," he said, and there was something in his voice that made Caroline's heart race. "I was not expecting you." "I hope I am not intruding," Caroline said, suddenly nervous. "I wanted to thank you properly before I leave for Boston." Something shifted in Holt's expression, a flash of disappointment quickly hidden. "You are going back east, my father wants me to," Caroline said. "He thinks it is best if I start over somewhere new, away from all the gossip." Holt nodded slowly. "That makes sense, fresh start." He looked away toward the distant mesas. "When do you leave?" 3 days, Caroline said. Then, before she could lose her courage, she added, "But I am not sure I want to go." Holt's eyes snapped back to her. "No, no," Caroline said, her voice gaining strength. "I have been thinking about what you said, about how trusting people is not a character flaw. And I realized that if I run back to Boston, I am letting Thomas Garrett win. I am letting him make me afraid to trust again, afraid to stay in a place I was starting to love." "This is a hard territory," Holt said carefully. "Not always kind to people, especially women on their own." "I know that," Caroline said, "but I do not want to spend my life being safe and sheltered. I want to be brave enough to stay, to build a life here." She took a breath. "And I keep thinking about you." The words hung in the air between them. Holt took a step closer, his gray eyes searching her face. "You think about me?" "Yes," Caroline said simply. "I think about your kindness, the way you helped me without expecting anything in return. The way you made me feel safe when I had every reason to be afraid." She felt her cheeks heating but forced herself to continue. "I know we barely know each other, and maybe this is foolish, but I wanted you to know before I left. You made an impression on me, James Holloway." Holt was quiet for a long moment, and Caroline felt her courage starting to waver. Then he smiled, a real smile that transformed his serious face into something warm and open. "You made an impression on me too," he said. "I have not been able to stop thinking about you since that night. The way you were so determined to keep walking even though you were freezing. The way you held your head up even after everything that happened. You are the bravest woman I have ever met, Caroline Montgomery." Caroline felt tears prick her eyes at the words. "I do not feel brave." "That is what makes it courage," Holt said. He took another step closer, close enough that Caroline could see the gold flecks in his gray eyes. "Caroline, if you stay in Santa Fe, I would like to call on you properly, court you the right way with no lies or tricks. Just an honest man trying to win the heart of a remarkable woman." "I would like that," Caroline whispered. "But I need you to be sure," Holt said. "I am not a rich man. This ranch is small and I work hard just to keep it going. I cannot offer you the kind of life you would have in Boston. If you stay, it will be a hard life in a hard land." Caroline thought about Boston, the comfortable house, the social events, the predictable routine of days. Then she thought about New Mexico, the vast sky, the red rock mesas, the freedom of a place where she could reinvent herself. And she thought about Holt, this quiet cowboy who had given her his coat without hesitation. "I am sure," she said. The joy that lit Holt's face made Caroline's decision feel right in a way nothing had felt right since she arrived in New Mexico. He reached out and took her hand carefully, as if she were something precious. "Then I am the luckiest man in the territory," he said. They stood there for a moment, hands clasped, looking at each other with a mix of hope and nervousness and something that might have been the beginning of love. Then Holt seemed to remember himself and stepped back slightly. "Would you like to come inside?" he asked. "I have got coffee, and you can tell me how we are going to convince your father to let you stay." Caroline laughed, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. "That is going to take some doing. He is very protective. I imagine he has good reason to be after what happened," Holt said, "but I will do my best to prove to him that I am nothing like Thomas Garrett." They went inside, and Holt made coffee while Caroline sat at the same table where she had eaten breakfast that morning after he rescued her. It felt both familiar and strange to be here again, but this time by choice rather than necessity. "Tell me about yourself," Caroline said. "I realize I know almost nothing about you except that you are kind to strangers in torn wedding dresses." Holt smiled at that. "Not much to tell. I grew up in Texas, came out here about 5 years ago looking to start over after my parents died. Bought this place cheap because the previous owner could not make it work, and I have been slowly building it up ever since. I run cattle mostly with a few horses for training on the side." "No wife or family?" Caroline asked, then immediately felt her cheeks heat. "I am sorry, that was too forward." "No, it is a fair question," Holt said. "No wife. I was engaged once back in Texas, but she decided she would rather marry a man with better prospects. She was probably right to do it. I did not have much to offer then, and I do not have much more now." "You have integrity," Caroline said. "That matters more than money." "Some women do not see it that way," Holt said, but there was no bitterness in his voice, just acceptance. "What about you? How did a Boston lady end up in New Mexico?" Caroline told him about her illness, the pneumonia that had lingered all through the previous winter, her father's decision to send her to the dry climate to recover. She told him about her Aunt Margaret, who had lived in Santa Fe for 20 years after marrying a merchant who later died in a mining accident. She explained how she had been charmed by New Mexico's dramatic landscape and the sense of possibility that seemed to hang in the air. "And then I met Thomas," she said. "Or the man I thought was Thomas. He was everything I thought I wanted, handsome, charming, attentive. He made me feel special. I see now that I was lonely and he took advantage of that." "You were not wrong to want those things," Holt said gently. "And you will find them again with someone who deserves you." The way he looked at her when he said it made Caroline's heart skip. She had known this man for barely 2 weeks, most of that time spent apart, but she felt more drawn to him than she had ever felt toward Thomas despite weeks of courtship. Maybe it was because Holt's kindness was real, not performed. Maybe it was because he had seen her at her absolute worst and still thought she was brave. They talked for another hour, and Caroline felt the connection between them growing stronger with each shared story and laugh. When she finally said she should return to her aunt's house before dark, Holt walked her out to the buggy and helped her up onto the seat. "Will you come to dinner tomorrow night?" Caroline asked. "I want you to meet my father properly." Holt looked nervous but nodded. "I will be there. What time?" 6 o'clock, Caroline said, "and Holt, be yourself. That is all I need from you." "I will do my best," Holt promised. Caroline drove back to Santa Fe with her mind whirling. She knew her father would not be happy about her decision to stay, and he would be even less happy about her interest in a cowboy with a small ranch and modest prospects. But Caroline was 22 years old enough to make her own choices. She had survived betrayal and abandonment in the desert. She could survive her father's disapproval too. That evening, she told her father and aunt about her decision. Charles Montgomery was predictably upset, arguing that Caroline should come home where she would be safe from more fortune hunters and scoundrels. Aunt Margaret was more supportive, pointing out that Caroline seemed happier and healthier than she had been in months. "There is someone," Caroline admitted finally, "a good man who helped me when I needed it most. I want the chance to know him better." Her father's expression grew thunderous. "Caroline, you cannot be serious." After what just happened with that criminal, you want to throw yourself at another Western man. James Holloway is nothing like Thomas Garrett, Caroline said firmly. He is honest and kind and hardworking. He is coming to dinner tomorrow night, and I want you to meet him with an open mind. Absolutely not, Charles said. We are leaving for Boston in 3 days, and that is final. Caroline felt a surge of rebellion unlike anything she had experienced before. No, Papa, she said quietly. I am staying, I am an adult, and I am making my own choice. The argument went on for another hour, with Charles growing increasingly frustrated and Caroline holding her ground with a stubbornness she had not known she possessed. Finally, Aunt Margaret intervened. Charles, let the man come to dinner, she said. Give him a fair chance. If he is as good as Caroline says, you will see it, and if he is not, Caroline will see it too, but let her make her own decision. Charles clearly wanted to refuse, but eventually he gave in with poor grace. Fine, he said. But I will be watching this man very carefully, and if I see any hint of dishonesty or ulterior motives, I am taking you back to Boston whether you like it or not. It was not the wholehearted acceptance Caroline had hoped for, but it was something. She went to bed that night nervous about the dinner but also excited. Tomorrow she would see Holt again, and they would take the next step forward together. Holt arrived exactly at 6 the next evening, dressed in his best clothes and carrying a bouquet of wildflowers for Margaret and a bottle of wine for Charles. He looked scrubbed and nervous, and Caroline wanted to hug him for being so earnest. Instead, she greeted him formally and introduced him to her father. Charles Montgomery shook Holt's hand with obvious reluctance, his banker's eye taking in every detail of the younger man's appearance. The dinner that followed was tense, with Charles asking pointed questions about Holt's ranch, his income, his prospects for the future. Holt answered honestly, not trying to exaggerate or impress, just stating the facts of his life. So you are telling me you have a small ranch with maybe 50 head of cattle, you live alone, and you make barely enough to survive, Charles said finally. And you think this is an appropriate life to offer my daughter? No, sir, I do not, Holt said, surprising everyone. Caroline deserves better than what I can offer right now. But I am working to build something more, and I promise you I will work every day to give her a good life. I cannot offer her wealth, but I can offer her honesty, loyalty, and all the love I have. The simple sincerity of the words seemed to catch Charles off guard. He studied Holt for a long moment, then looked at Caroline, who was watching Holt with undisguised affection. You care for him, Charles said to his daughter. It was not a question. I do, Caroline said. I know it is fast, and I know it must seem reckless after what happened with Thomas. But Holt is different. He is real. Charles sighed heavily. I cannot stop you from making your own choices, Caroline. You are an adult, but I want you to think carefully about what you are giving up. Boston society comforts security. Your mother and I hoped you would marry well, someone who could give you the life you were raised to expect. I do not want that life anymore, Papa, Caroline said gently. I want this one. I want the chance to build something of my own, to be brave and independent, and I want to do it with Holt if he will have me. Holt reached across the table and took Caroline's hand, right there in front of her father and aunt. I will have you, he said, for as long as you will have me. The gesture was bold and public, a clear declaration of intention. Charles looked at their joined hands, and something in his stern expression softened slightly. At least take some time, he said. Court properly for a few months. Make sure this is what you really want. Can you promise me that much? Yes, Caroline said. I promise. The rest of the dinner passed more easily, with Aunt Margaret asking Holt about his horses and the sheriff's pursuit of the Garrett gang. By the time Holt left, Charles seemed grudgingly willing to give him a chance, though he made it clear he would be staying in Santa Fe for the next 2 months to keep an eye on things. Over the following weeks, Holt courted Caroline properly, riding into town 3 times a week to take her on walks around the plaza or to dinner at her aunt's house. They talked for hours, learning each other's histories and dreams. Caroline discovered that Holt loved to read, that he had a dry sense of humor that emerged once he felt comfortable, that he was deeply loyal to the few friends he had. Holt learned that Caroline played the piano beautifully, that she was passionate about education and wanted to start a school someday, that she had a stubborn streak a mile wide when she believed in something. Charles watched their courtship with the careful attention of a protective father, but even he had to admit that Holt treated Caroline with respect and genuine affection. There were no grand romantic gestures, no elaborate gifts, just steady attention and honest conversation. After the artifice of Thomas Garrett's performance, it was exactly what Caroline needed. 2 months after that first dinner, Holt asked Charles for permission to marry Caroline. Charles made him sweat through a long conversation about responsibilities and expectations, but in the end, he gave his blessing. "I want my daughter to be happy," Charles said, "and I can see that you make her happy. Take care of her, young man, or you will have me to answer to." "I will spend every day of my life taking care of her," Holt promised. He proposed to Caroline that evening, taking her for a ride up into the hills above his ranch at sunset. The sky was ablaze with color, red and orange and purple spreading across the horizon, and the valley below was bathed in golden light. "Caroline," Holt said, dismounting and helping her down from the horse, "these past 2 months have been the best of my life. You make me want to be a better man, to build something worth building. I know I cannot offer you wealth or an easy life, but I can offer you my whole heart. Will you marry me?" He pulled out a simple silver ring, nothing fancy, just a plain band that he had bought from a jeweler in Santa Fe with money saved over many weeks. Caroline looked at the ring, then at Holt's hopeful, nervous face and felt her heart overflow. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Holt slipped the ring onto her finger, and then he kissed her for the first time, soft and careful and full of promise. Caroline wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back, pouring all her hope and happiness into the moment. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "I love you," Caroline said. "I think I have loved you since that night you gave me your coat." "I love you too," Holt said. "I have loved you since I saw you walking through that canyon, too stubborn to give up even though you were freezing. You are the strongest person I know." They stood there as the sun set and the stars began to emerge, holding each other and planning their future. It would be a simple wedding, Caroline said, just family and close friends. Holt promised to add a room onto the ranch house for them to grow into. They talked about the cattle they would raise, the horses they would train, the life they would build together in this hard, beautiful land. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the same chapel where Caroline had almost married Thomas Garrett, but this time everything was different. This time the groom was real, the vows were genuine, and the love was true. Caroline wore a simple blue dress instead of an elaborate wedding gown, and Holt wore his best suit with the silver watch chain his father had given him. Charles Montgomery walked his daughter down the aisle with tears in his eyes, and Aunt Margaret cried openly throughout the ceremony. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Holt kissed Caroline with a joy that made everyone in the small chapel smile. This was how a wedding was supposed to feel, Caroline thought. Not performative or false, but real and right and full of hope. They held a simple reception at Aunt Margaret's house with food and music and dancing. Charles gave a toast wishing his daughter happiness and warning Holt that he would be checking in regularly to make sure Caroline was well cared for. Holt gave a toast thanking everyone for accepting him into the family and promising to spend his life making Caroline happy. As the sun set and the party wound down, Holt and Caroline rode out to their ranch together, Caroline seated behind him on the horse just as she had been that first night. But this time, she was not shivering in a torn wedding dress, running from betrayal. This time she was warm and safe, riding toward a future she had chosen with a man she loved. The ranch house glowed with lamplight as they approached, and Caroline felt a surge of happiness at the sight of it. This was home now, This small, sturdy building in the high desert with its view of distant mesas and endless sky. She had not expected to find this when she came to New Mexico, but now she could not imagine wanting anything else. Holt helped her down from the horse, and then, in a gesture that made Caroline laugh with delight, he swept her up into his arms and carried her over the threshold. Inside, he had prepared the house beautifully, with flowers on the table and the fire burning warm and bright. "Welcome home, Mrs. Holloway," he said, setting her down gently. "I like the sound of that," Caroline said, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Mrs. Holloway." They spent their first night as husband and wife talking and laughing and dreaming about the future, and when they finally fell asleep in each other's arms, Caroline felt a peace she had never known before. This was where she belonged, she thought. Not in Boston drawing rooms or at society events, but here in this wild territory with a man who loved her for exactly who she was. The first year of marriage was not easy. Caroline had to learn how to cook over a wood stove, how to preserve food for winter, how to help with the cattle and horses. Her hands, once soft from a privileged life, became calloused from work. There were days when she was so tired she could barely stand, days when she missed the comforts of Boston and wondered what she had gotten herself into. But there were also moments of pure joy. Learning to ride well enough to help Holt move the cattle to new pasture. Watching the sunset from the porch every evening, Holt's arm around her shoulders. The first time they made love, awkward and sweet and full of laughter when things did not go quite as planned. Slowly but surely, Caroline became not just Holt's wife but his true partner, working beside him to build their life together. By the end of that first year, the ranch was doing better. They had increased their herd to 75 head, and Holt's reputation as a horse trainer was growing. Caroline started teaching reading and writing to children from nearby ranches twice a week, holding classes in their small living room. It was not the formal school she had dreamed of, but it was a start. Word came that Thomas Garrett had been sentenced to 20 years in prison for his crimes. Caroline felt nothing when she heard the news, no triumph or satisfaction, just relief that it was over. That chapter of her life was closed and she had no desire to revisit it. In the spring of their second year together, Caroline discovered she was pregnant. The news filled both her and Holt with joy and terror in equal measure. They were so far from town, and Caroline knew that childbirth was dangerous, especially out here where medical help was limited. But Holt held her close and promised he would take care of her, and Caroline chose to believe him. She wrote to her father with the news, and Charles immediately sent money for them to hire help and make improvements to the house. Despite his initial reservations about Holt, Charles had come to respect his son-in-law's work ethic and devotion to Caroline. He visited twice a year and always came away impressed by how the ranch was growing and how happy Caroline seemed. The pregnancy was difficult. Caroline was sick for months, and the summer heat of the high desert was oppressive. But Holt was patient and attentive, doing more than his share of the work so Caroline could rest. He read to her in the evenings, rubbed her aching back, and told her stories about the life they would give their child. In late October, as the leaves on the cottonwood trees turned gold and the air grew crisp, Caroline went into labor. Holt had brought Aunt Margaret out to the ranch a week earlier to help, and together they coached Caroline through the long, painful process. 20 hours after the first contraction, Caroline gave birth to a healthy baby boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's determination. They named him Thomas Charles Holloway after both their fathers, but they called him Tommy. Holt held his son with tears streaming down his face, and Caroline watched her strong, steady husband become completely undone by the tiny person in his arms. "We made this," Holt said wonderingly. "You and me, we made this perfect little person." "We did," Caroline agreed, exhausted and happy and more in love with Holt than ever. The next few years were a blur of hard work and small joys. Tommy grew into a lively, curious child who loved helping his father with the horses. Caroline's school expanded until she had 15 regular students, and she and Holt built a small schoolhouse on their property with help from neighboring ranchers. The cattle herd grew to over 100 head, and Holt's horse training business was thriving. When Tommy was 3, Caroline became pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier. She gave birth to a daughter they named Grace Margaret, after Caroline's mother and aunt. Grace had Caroline's dark hair and Holt's quiet intensity, and from the moment she was born, she had her father wrapped around her tiny finger. Life on the ranch was busy and exhausting, but Caroline could not imagine being happier. She had found her purpose in teaching and in building a life with Holt. She had found her home in this wild territory that had once seemed so foreign. And she had found love with a man who proved every day that he was worth her trust. Charles Montgomery came to visit when Grace was 6 months old, and he stayed for a month, helping with repairs to the barn and spoiling his grandchildren shamelessly. One evening, as he and Caroline sat on the porch watching Holt teach Tommy how to rope a fence post, Charles put his arm around his daughter. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "When you told me you wanted to stay here, I thought you were making a mistake. I thought you would regret giving up the life you could have had in Boston. But looking at you now, I can see that you made the right choice. You are happy, truly happy, and that is all I ever wanted for you." "I am happy, Papa," Caroline said. "This is exactly the life I was meant to have." The years continued to pass, each bringing its own challenges and rewards. There were droughts that tested their resilience and hard winters that made Caroline grateful for the security Holt had built. There were sick children and broken bones and cattle lost to disease. But there were also birthdays and holidays, achievements celebrated and milestones reached. Tommy's first successful horse training at age 10, Grace reading her first book at age 5, the year they finally paid off the mortgage on the ranch. Caroline sometimes thought about that night Holt found her in the canyon, shivering in her torn wedding dress, certain her life was ruined. She had been so lost then, so convinced that Thomas Garrett's betrayal meant she could never trust again. But Holt had shown her that there were still good people in the world, people who helped without expecting anything in return. He had given her his coat and his kindness, and in doing so, he had given her a future she never could have imagined. When Tommy turned 12 and Grace turned 9, Caroline finally opened her formal school in Santa Fe, a real building with multiple classrooms and several teachers. She had saved money for years to make it happen, and Holt had supported her dream even when it meant less money for the ranch. The school's opening day was one of the proudest moments of Caroline's life, second only to her wedding day and the births of her children. Holt was there for the ribbon-cutting ceremony, standing beside her in his best suit, his hair streaked with gray now, but his gray eyes still as steady and kind as they had been that first night. When Caroline finished her speech about the importance of education and opportunity, Holt took her hand and squeezed it gently. "Your father would be proud," he said. Charles had passed away 2 years earlier, dying peacefully in his sleep after spending one last summer on the ranch with his family. "I am proud. I could not have done any of this without you," Caroline said. "You gave me the freedom to dream." "You gave yourself that freedom," Holt said. "I just loved you while you did it." That evening, after the celebration wound down and they drove back to the ranch with Tommy and Grace asleep in the back of the wagon, Caroline leaned against Holt's shoulder and thought about how far they had come. From that desperate night in the canyon to this moment of triumph, they had built a life together that was so much richer than anything she had imagined when she was young. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Holt. "Marrying a stubborn Boston woman who did not know the first thing about ranch life?" Holt looked down at her with a smile. "Not for a single second," he said. "Marrying you was the best decision I ever made. You made me believe in love again, Caroline. You made me believe in myself." "You did the same for me," Caroline said. "That night you found me, I thought my life was over. I thought I would never trust anyone again, but you showed me what real love looks like, patient and steady and true." They rode the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, and when they finally put the children to bed and sat together on the porch watching the stars, Caroline felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. This was everything she had never known she wanted. A good man who loved her children who were healthy and happy, work that mattered, a home they had built together from nothing. The next 15 years brought more changes. Tommy grew into a fine young man who took over much of the ranch work, eventually marrying a schoolteacher from Santa Fe and building his own house on the property. Grace became a teacher herself, working alongside her mother at the school and showing a particular gift for helping struggling students. Caroline and Holt became grandparents, first to Tommy's son James, then to his daughter Sarah, then to twin boys named Peter and Paul. Through it all, Caroline and Holt remained each other's constant support and companion. They grew old together, their hands becoming wrinkled and spotted, their hair turning gray and then white. Holt's back grew stiff from years of hard work, and Caroline's eyes grew weak from years of reading. But their love, if anything, grew stronger with time, deepened by shared experiences and mutual respect. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Holt took Caroline back to the spot where he had proposed, the hillside above the ranch with its view of the valley below. They rode up on horseback, moving more slowly than they once had, but still comfortable in the saddle after all these years. "Do you remember the first time I brought you here?" Holt asked as they stood looking out over the land they had built their life upon. "I remember everything about that day," Caroline said. "You were so nervous when you proposed, your hands were shaking." "I was terrified you would say no," Holt admitted. "I knew I did not have much to offer you. You offered me everything that mattered," Caroline said. She turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. "You offered me honesty and loyalty and love. You offered me a partnership, a real marriage where we faced everything together. That was worth more than all the money in Boston." Holt pulled her close and kissed her, and Caroline thought that even after 30 years, his kiss still made her heart race. "I would do it all again," he said. "Every hard day, every challenge, every moment, I would choose you every time." "And I would choose you," Caroline said. "The cowboy who wrapped me in his coat and rode me home." They stood there for a long time, holding each other and watching the sun set over the valley. Two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built a love that lasted. And when they finally rode back down to the ranch house, where their grandchildren were waiting to help them celebrate, Caroline knew that her life had turned out exactly as it was meant to. The years that followed were quieter. Holt and Caroline gradually turned over most of the ranch work to Tommy and his family, though Holt still liked to spend his mornings working with the horses, and Caroline still taught reading to any child who needed help. They traveled occasionally, visiting Boston to see old friends and show their grandchildren where Caroline had grown up. But they always came back to New Mexico, to the high desert that had become home, to the ranch that held all their memories. On a cool November morning, 42 years after that night in the canyon, Caroline woke to find Holt standing by the bedroom window, looking out at the sunrise. She got up and joined him, sliding her arm around his waist. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "I was remembering the day I found you," Holt said. "Shivering in that torn wedding dress, too proud to give up even though you were freezing. I thought you were the bravest person I had ever met, and I was right." "I was terrified," Caroline admitted. "But then you came along and gave me your coat, and suddenly everything did not seem quite so impossible." "Best coat I ever owned," Holt said with a smile. "Giving it to you brought me everything I ever wanted." Caroline leaned her head against his shoulder, and they stood together watching the sun paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. After 42 years of marriage, they could communicate in silence, understanding each other without words. They had built a good life together, raised good children, created something lasting and meaningful. And through it all, the love that began with a simple act of kindness had sustained them. "I would do it again," Caroline said quietly, echoing Holt's words from their anniversary. "All of it." The heartbreak with Thomas, the fear in the canyon, all of it, because it brought me to you. And I will be grateful for the rest of my life that I decided to ride through that canyon that night," Holt said. "Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me." They stayed there watching the sunrise until they heard the sounds of their grandchildren waking up in the house Tommy had built next door. Soon there would be breakfast to make and children to feed and work to be done. But for this moment, Caroline and Holt simply held each other, two people who had found love in the most unexpected way and made it last a lifetime. Their story became something of a legend in the territory, told and retold by people who remembered the scandal of Caroline's failed wedding and the quiet cowboy who had saved her. But to Caroline and Holt, it was not a legend. It was simply their life, built day by day through hard work and mutual devotion, through laughter and tears, through challenges overcome and dreams achieved. When Caroline was 68 and Holt was 72, they sat on the porch of the ranch house they had shared for over 4 decades, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren. It was Thanksgiving, and the whole family had gathered to celebrate together. Inside, the women were preparing an enormous feast, and outside, the men were talking about cattle and horses and the future of the ranch. Holt took Caroline's hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "We did all right, did we not?" he said. Caroline looked at their family, at the ranch that had grown from a struggling operation to a thriving business, at the school she had built that now served hundreds of children every year. She thought about all the years of love and partnership, all the moments of joy and sorrow they had shared. And she smiled. "We did better than all right," she said. "We did wonderfully." As the sun set over the New Mexico landscape they both loved, turning the sky brilliant with color, Caroline thought back one more time to that November night so many years ago when a cowboy had found her shivering in a torn wedding dress. She remembered how he had wrapped her in his coat without hesitation, how he had taken her home and given her shelter and asked for nothing in return. That single act of kindness had changed everything, had given her a future she never could have imagined. Holt had been right when he said she was strong enough to survive on her own. But she was grateful she had not had to, grateful that he had appeared when she needed him most, grateful that they had chosen to build a life together. Their love had started with a coat and a cold night in the desert, but it had grown into something beautiful and lasting, something that had shaped not just their lives but the lives of their children and grandchildren. "Thank you," Caroline said to Holt, squeezing his hand gently. "For what?" Holt asked, though his smile suggested he knew. "For finding me," Caroline said. "For giving me your coat, for taking me home, for loving me, for all of it." Holt raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Thank you for letting me," he said. "Thank you for staying, for choosing this life, for choosing me. You made me the luckiest man in the world, Caroline Holloway." They sat together as their family gathered around them for the Thanksgiving meal, as the house filled with laughter and love and the warmth of togetherness. And as Caroline looked at everything they had built, she knew with absolute certainty that every difficult moment, every challenge, every hardship had been worth it. This was the life she was meant to live, and Holt was the man she was meant to love. Years later, when both Caroline and Holt had passed on peacefully in their sleep within days of each other, their children found a letter Caroline had written to be read after her death. In it, she told the full story of that November night when Holt had found her in the canyon, and she explained how that moment had changed everything. She wrote about the importance of kindness, of trusting again after betrayal, of being brave enough to choose love even when it seemed risky. But most of all, she wrote about Holt, the quiet cowboy who had given her his coat and in doing so had given her a life beyond her wildest dreams. She wrote about how his steady love had sustained her through 4 decades of marriage, how his support had allowed her to achieve things she never thought possible, how his presence had made every day brighter and every burden lighter. The letter ended with these words: If you take nothing else from my story, remember this. True love is not about grand gestures or passionate declarations. It is about the small acts of kindness repeated daily, the steady support through good times and bad, the choice to stay and build something together even when it is hard. Holt showed me that love on a cold November night when he wrapped me in his coat, and he continued to show me that love every day for the rest of our lives. I was the luckiest woman in the world because I had the wisdom to recognize real love when I found it, and the courage to hold on to it no matter what. May you all be as lucky and as wise as I was. The Holloway Ranch continued to thrive under Tommy's stewardship and later under his children's management. Caroline's school grew into one of the finest educational institutions in the territory and eventually the state of New Mexico. The story of Caroline and Holt became part of family lore, told to each new generation as an example of what true love looked like. And sometimes, on cold November nights, people swore they could see two figures on horseback riding through the canyon where it all began, a woman wrapped in a man's coat, riding home together just as they had so many years ago. Whether it was real or just a story did not matter. What mattered was the legacy of love Caroline and Holt had left behind, proof that even in the hardest circumstances, kindness and courage and true devotion could create something beautiful and lasting. Their graves sat side by side on a hillside overlooking the ranch, marked with simple stones that bore their names and dates in one line. Together forever, as we always were. And anyone who visited could see the love that had grown from that first cold night, when a cowboy wrapped a shivering woman in his coat and rode her home, beginning a love story that lasted a lifetime and beyond.